coverage of the life of Dan Flood and this final tribute for them, and we thank all of them for what they have done to make the community conscious of somebody who lived his 80 years and could easily have been forgotten by a generation, and we do thank them. This morning's Scranton paper, though, the mayor would have noticed when I did, it started off by saying raised to sainthood, which I thought even Dan might think would be a little much to ask, but it turned out it is the Orthodox Church have a Saint Alexis. But it didn't surprise me totally when I had seen it. We did tell a lot of the Dan Flood stories, and when Mike and I had a chance to tell a few on television, the one that I remember somebody told me, I was not a witness to it, that he was having a hearing and he was helping a German scientist who had a program that Dan was interested in, and he was leaning over helping him to make the presentation, and he was saying, "Here, doctor, tell them how much good this is going to do mankind. Here, doctor, tell them to them." And the fellow stopped and he said, "Mr. Chairman, I never finished my degree and I'm not a doctor." And Dan leaned over and he said, "Here, doctor, when this chair calls you a doctor, you are a doctor." It wouldn't take much to encourage me on that. Garrison Keillor in the press club said something kind of remarkable the other day. He said he's not high on his own generation because he looks in amazement at the generation that went before him, who knew what depression was, and they knew what war was, and they knew what unemployment was, and he thinks that gave them a chance to be more appreciative. I, who have not always maybe the members of the political life that are here in front of me will attest, have maybe been as kind as I should have been to political leaders at all time. But I hope they trust it has been done in good spirit, because good politicians, as much as a forgiving church, understand human nature. They're realistic about human nature. They're not crushed by ingratitude. They have an understanding of what happens, and that there is a certain percentage of people respond and they're not wounded by it. And as long as we have people of caliber, so many of whom are gathered here, to continue the political life of this country, we, I think, are well served. And Dan was so much like that. In our liturgy ceremony, in this leave taking, the word liturgy says what one does to identify themselves. If you were a baker, the baking was your liturgy. If you're in political life, all that we've heard from Father Lachenmeyer so well is what your responsibilities are. Scriptures have a statement at the end of John. When you're young, you put a cincture about yourself and you go any place you want to go. But when you're older, another ties a cincture about you and takes you where maybe you would rather not go. And I think the cincture is political life. It makes demands beyond imagination. And it's rare we find somebody who so lived up to those demands and seemed almost to thrive on them, but served them in some fashion. There's a strange story of Jacob and the angel in the scriptures. And a fellow named John Forsythe had a book out on it. I never understood the story. In the story, Jacob took this messenger of God and they wrestled all night, and neither could overcome the other. And finally, in the morning, the angel reached over and crippled Jacob. And he limped away from the fray, and that ended the battle where he was defeated. And John Forsythe said, what the message is that unless you're wounded, unless you're defeated, unless you're hurt, unless you limp, you never can reach the potential of who you are as a human being. And we found that in Dan. His better years were his final acceptance when he came back home, the wounded warrior and part of us. William Butler Yeats said, "Nature framed in fault, there is comfort now and then, and salt. Nature usually bad, base, even blind. Clearly, thou canst occasionally be kind." We're going to have tributes from the people who've shared Dan's life so much. They will come without introduction, and they all have a message. Governor Casey.
First, to Catherine, I bring the sincere condolences of the people of Pennsylvania in your loss, which all of us share today. The Dan Flood stories, of course, are as numerous as the people in this church. One of the stories I like of all of those is one the late Senator Martin L. Murray used to tell that involved the senator himself. One day during a campaign, President Kennedy came here to campaign in Luzerne County. And, of course, he was met at the airport in the big white Cadillac convertible, and in the front seat sat Senator Murray, in the back seat Congressman Flood and President Kennedy. And as they left the airport, they came down toward Wilkes-Barre, and every 100 feet or so were these huge billboards. If you recall, when Dan would run, he didn't have to buy much advertising, but he would always buy these big billboards, and of course, on the billboards was one word. You guessed it, flood, in letters about 10 feet high. And Kennedy saw about 10 of these, and flood, 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 and finally he turned to Dan and said, "Hey, Dan, don't you have any Kennedy signs?" And Dan didn't bat an eye. He reached up to Marty Murray and said, "Yeah, Marty, where are the Kennedy signs?" We come together today to celebrate the life of Daniel J. Flood. He has been called an American original, larger than life, one of the most powerful men in America, the best congressman in the country. He was, of course, all of these things, but to his people, he was something more. To the retired coal miner who came to Dan for help with those telltale dark blue marks on his hands and face from where the cuts and the bruises and the bumps got dirt in them, never quite healed. The same fellow with lungs like concrete from black lung, struggling for breath. To him, Dan Flood was something more. To the widow who wrote to him for help because she needed medical care for a sick child which she couldn't afford, to her, Dan Flood was something more, something much more. The legacy of Dan Flood can be seen all around us. Yes, in public buildings and landmark legislation which bear his name. But even more, we can see that legacy in the minds and hearts of his people. Because Dan Flood never forgot his roots. He never forgot where he came from. He never forgot his people. Dan Flood needs no monument of steel or stone, because his monument is in the lives of the people he helped in ways large and small, the people to whom he brought hope. And so today we celebrate that life which brought help and hope to so many. And we find in the liturgy and in our faith an echo of that hope. Because just as Dan Flood was larger than life, our faith teaches us that he is larger than death. And so today, in the spirit of that faith, we come to say to Dan Flood, not goodbye, but till we meet again.
Dan would have liked this audience. He always liked to talk to a large crowd. It brought out a special magic in him. Those of us that had the pleasure of knowing Dan during his lifetime all have a story, as the governor has said. Mine goes back to just when I was a wee child, really, in the late 40s, when Catherine and Dan were married. If you recall, he had a special place in Nanticoke, and they held a mock wedding. And I had the pleasure of playing Dan in that mock wedding when I was all of 9 years of age. And from that point on until the last moment I talked to Dan Flood, when I talked to him on the occasion of his 90th birthday, he was always the congressman to me. And although I've held that role for some years, and I have my colleagues who have succeeded Dan, we all knew that in Luzerne County, in northeastern Pennsylvania, in the 11th Congressional District, Dan Flood would always be the congressman. And as I sat here and listened to Father Lackameyer and the governor talk, I wonder why that is, and how so many of us in our lifetime will identify someone as a baker, as a doctor, as a teacher, or as a congressman. And how do you get to be that? How are you that? Dan was, I guess, first and foremost an actor, before it was easy for an actor to be in politics. If you know, he preceded Ronald Reagan by a number of years. But you know, Dan just wasn't an actor. He was a Shakespearean actor. He always had that magic touch. He understood that he had to move people beyond themselves. And then he became a lawyer, and he did it with great flair. Last night, I listened to the late Lou Feldman describe Dan's first case, and only those of us that knew Dan Flood could ever believe that he could appear to have been a seasoned member of the bar in trying his first case before an appellate court. And then there were those of us in Luzerne County that remember Dan Flood. He came to power when coal was just dying in 1944. And he shepherded our area through a growth of a district and a demise of a population. He saw the weaknesses of a single central industrial might, and he saw the scars and the wear of that upon the people. And he rose to that special occasion as only he could. He rose to the level of being one of 537 elected people that run this government. But he just didn't do it for a while. He did it for 32 years. He entered the Congress of the United States at just the last end of the Second World War and served in 8 presidencies and served with distinction. I don't know what our final resolve will be or what history will say of Dan. Maybe it will be written after we're gone and in a different light than we would see it. But as I see Dan Flood, he had that special magic of a human being to know when people were hurt, to provide for them, to lend an ear for those who were not as articulate as some, and then a driving force, as the governor said, to never forget from whence he came. In 32 years in the Congress of the United States, Dan Flood met and knew every president, spent time at the White House and in palaces and houses of leadership throughout the world. But when his term was done, he came back to his house on North Main Street, and he returned to become one of us. If that's how we would define a congressman, I can't think of a finer description. And yes, Dan, I saw a cartoon in the Times later today, and it shows Dan and his wings going off to the Golden Gate, and I know damn well he was going and saying, "Murph, I'm here," and St. Peter would have taken back a little bit of a start. And he'd say, "Murph, where's the boss?" And he'll leave us with the million stories that we've all experienced, the pleasant thoughts, but most of all, he's left us richer than we would have been if he hadn't come. Farewell, Dan.
Monsignor McGowan and members of the clergy, lovely Catherine, and friends, one and all, of Dan Flood. You know, it would be a dreadfully hard thing if we'd come here today in the gentle breezes of this Memorial Day celebration just to mourn Dan Flood. Think of what we've already heard None of us are here just to mourn